what makes Australia truly fascinating? It's not just the kangaroos or the endless beaches. It's the stories hidden beneath the surface. A nation that won independence without war. A political system that's a clever mashup of American and British traditions. A flower, the Golden Waddle, that thrives after bushfires just like its people. Even Melbourne, now a hub of coffee culture, was once the richest city in the world thanks to the gold rush. Australia is a place where history takes unexpected turns, where resilience is woven into the land and its people. Curious yet? Let's dive into what makes this country one of the most surprising and inspiring places on Earth. Australia's path to independence is as remarkable as it is unique. While much of the world's history is shaped by bloody revolutions and wars, Australia took a completely different approach. No battles, no uprisings, just a bold vision and a steadfast belief in peaceful negotiation. By the late 19th century, the 6 colonies of Australia were thriving, yet disconnected. Each governed itself, but they faced growing challenges that demanded unity: defense, trade, infrastructure. Instead of rebelling against British rule, as many nations had, Australians chose a path of dialogue and diplomacy. Through years of discussions, conventions, and referendums, the colonies built a case for federation. And here's the twist. The British government didn't resist. Seeing the practicality of a self-governed, federated Australia, they supported the move. In 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia was born, not as the result of war, but as the fruit of peaceful negotiation. This wasn't merely a handover of power. The colonies thoughtfully crafted a system that preserved local autonomy while establishing a central government to handle national priorities like defense and foreign relations. It was a masterclass in compromise, a blend of unity and independence that worked. Compare this with the bloody revolutions of the United States or the drawn-out struggles in Europe and East Asia. Australia's story stands as a refreshing exception, a nation forged not by force, but by mutual respect and shared goals. Australia didn't earn the nickname the lucky country by chance. It earned it through a determination to resolve differences without bloodshed. It's a story that shows how sometimes the pen truly is mightier than the sword, and that progress can be just as impactful when it's peaceful. When it comes to political design, Australia pulled off something remarkable. Rather than inventing a new system from scratch, the country masterfully blended 2 well-established models, America's federalism and Britain's parliamentary traditions, to create a system perfectly suited to its needs. Picture this. It's 1900, and Australia is about to become a federation. Its leaders had a tough task ahead: how to govern a nation as vast and diverse as Australia, with multiple states and a colonial history tied to Britain. Instead of choosing between American or British models, they asked, why not take the best of both? And that's exactly what they did. From the United States, they adopted federalism, giving each state its own powers, while creating a central government to handle national priorities. To ensure fairness and resolve disputes between states, they introduced the High Court, inspired by the U.S. Supreme Court. From Britain, they retained the Washminster System, with a parliamentary government led by a prime minister rather than an independent president. They also maintained a symbolic connection to the British monarchy through the Governor-General, ensuring continuity with the country's colonial past. This blend, nicknamed the Washminster System, wasn't groundbreaking in its invention, but in its practicality. Australia didn't just copy these systems. It adapted them, creating a structure that balanced unity and diversity, tradition and modernity. The result? A system that's democratic, flexible, and perfectly tailored to Australia's unique challenges. It's a reminder that sometimes the smartest move isn't starting from scratch, but knowing how to adapt and improve on what's already proven to work. Here's a fun fact. The secret ballot, one of democracy's greatest tools, was so closely tied to Australia that it was once called the Australian ballot. While the idea of voting in private wasn't new, Australia revolutionized it in the 1850s, making it simple, secure, and widely accessible. Back then, voting lacked privacy. Imagine standing in a crowded room, declaring your choice aloud while your boss or landlord looked on. Corruption and intimidation were common concerns. Australia addressed this by introducing a system where votes were cast in private, using standardized government-issued papers. It was a game changer. Suddenly, voters could make their choice without fear of repercussions. The rest of the world took notice, and soon, countries like the United States, Britain, and Canada adopted the Australian ballot. The term Australian ballot was once widely used in historical and academic discussions about electoral systems, particularly when referencing the origins of the modern secret ballot. Over time, however, this terminology has faded from everyday use in media. Today, it's commonly referred to as the secret ballot, emphasizing its core principle, privacy and protection for voters, which remains its defining feature. Here's something extraordinary. South Australia stood far ahead of its time. It was leading the world in the fight for gender equality. At a moment in history, when women in most countries were still battling for the right to vote, South Australia became the second place on Earth to grant women suffrage in 1894, following New Zealand. But here's the kicker. It took things even further. While many nations were still debating whether women should vote at all, South Australia not only opened the ballot box, but also granted women the right to stand for parliament. Imagine the boldness of that decision. Women in South Australia could now choose their leaders and aspire to become leaders themselves. At the time, this was leaps and bounds ahead of places like the United States and Britain, where the movement for women's suffrage was still in its early days. Picture it. In a world where equality for women was still a distant hope, South Australian women stepped forward with remarkable strength and determination. Their voices carried far beyond their own borders, sparking inspiration and change across the globe. This was more than a local triumph. It was a bold statement that the world could and should be different. Australia's history is more than a tale of triumphs and firsts. It's also a story of deep wounds and the resilience to heal. While the nation has led the world in democracy and gender equality, its treatment of Indigenous peoples has left a legacy that cannot be ignored. Imagine a culture thriving for tens of thousands of years, deeply connected to the land, its stories, and its ancestors. Now imagine that land being seized, its people marginalized, and their voices silenced. This was the reality faced by Indigenous Australians under policies designed to erase their identity. One of the darkest chapters is the story of the stolen generations. Beginning in 1869, under laws like the Aboriginal Protection Act, countless Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families. The intent? Assimilation. The result? A profound rupture that continues to echo through generations, severing communities from their heritage, language, and connection to the land. Even as Australia became a federation in 1901, Indigenous Australians were excluded from the national narrative. They were not counted in the census, denied citizenship, and left invisible in the eyes of the state. This exclusion wasn't a mere oversight. It was a deliberate denial of their place in the country's identity. But the tide of change, though slow, began to turn. In 1962, the Commonwealth Electoral Act granted all Indigenous Australians the right to vote in federal elections, marking a pivotal moment in their recognition as equal participants in the nation's democracy. 5 years later, the 1967 referendum amended the Constitution, allowing the federal government to legislate for Indigenous Australians and including them in the national census. These were more than administrative adjustments. They symbolized a long overdue acknowledgement of their existence and rights. In recent decades, Australia has taken further steps to address its past. A striking example is Uluru, a sacred site for the Anangu people. Originally named Uluru in the language of its traditional custodians, it was renamed Ayers Rock during colonial times to honor a European politician. Exploited as a tourist attraction for decades, Uluru was finally returned to its rightful owners in 1985. In 2019, a ban on climbing the sacred site was implemented, reflecting a deeper respect for its spiritual significance. Similarly, Gari, meaning paradise in the Butchula language, was renamed Fraser Island during colonial rule. It took years of advocacy, but the name Gari was officially restored, reclaiming its rightful place in the nation's geography and honoring the rich history of its indigenous custodians. The same recognition was given to Gari Word, once called the Grampians, acknowledging its deep spiritual connections for the indigenous peoples of the region. These restorations are more than symbolic. They represent a reclaiming of identity and heritage. The scars of the past remain, but with each step, from granting voting rights to returning sacred lands, Australia demonstrates its capacity to confront historical wrongs and take meaningful action. This journey isn't just about repairing the past. It's about shaping a future where every voice, story, and heritage is seen, heard, and celebrated. It's hard to believe now, but Australia wasn't always the multicultural haven it is today. In the early 20th century, the country followed the White Australia policy, a set of laws designed to keep its population almost entirely white and European. At the heart of this policy was a ruthless tool, the dictation test. Imagine traveling halfway across the world, dreaming of a better life, only to face a test in a random European language chosen on the spot. Greek, Italian, even Latvian. It wasn't about literacy. It was about making sure you failed if you didn't fit the mold. Why did they do this? Fear. Fear that Asian workers willing to take lower wages would compete with locals. Fear that cultural differences might challenge a young nation's identity. It was less about policy and more about clinging to a narrow vision of what Australia should look like. But then the world changed, and so did Australia. After World War II, the country needed workers to rebuild, and suddenly, the rigid barriers started to crack. First, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were welcomed, bringing fresh ideas and cultures. Slowly, more and more doors opened. By 1973, the White Australia policy was scrapped, making way for something better. And the result? A country that flipped the script entirely. Today, Australia is one of the most multicultural nations on the planet. Its food, festivals, and everyday life are shaped by the contributions of people from all over the globe. The White Australia policy is now a relic of the past, a stark reminder of where fear can lead and how embracing diversity can reshape a nation for the better. This is more than history. It's a compelling reminder of how nations thrive, not by closing doors, but by opening them wide. When it comes to symbols of strength and unity, a delicate flower might seem like an unlikely choice. Yet the Golden Waddle, Australia's national floral emblem, carries a story as uniquely Australian as the land it calls home, a story of perseverance, quiet power, and enduring beauty. While the kangaroo and emu steal the spotlight, the Golden Waddle quietly holds its place in the nation's identity. Declared the national floral emblem in 1912, its golden blossoms light up the landscape in late winter and early spring, bringing hope to regions that have faced droughts, fires, and other challenges. This flower doesn't just endure, it thrives, standing as a symbol of Australia's ability to overcome adversity and emerge even stronger. What sets the Golden Waddle apart is its remarkable ability to flourish in tough conditions. Whether in the dry outback, along coastal cliffs, or after devastating bushfires, it springs back with vibrant energy. Its story mirrors the Australian people's tenacity and ability to adapt, rising to meet every challenge with determination and strength. But the Golden Waddle isn't only about toughness. Its rich yellow color speaks of Australia's warmth and welcoming spirit, reflecting a nation that embraces diversity and connection. On Wattle Day, celebrated every September 1st, Australians take a moment to reflect on their shared journey. It's a celebration not simply of a flower, but of what it represents, a nation united by its many stories and a hope that shines as brightly as the wattle's golden blooms. about it. A quiet, sparsely populated land suddenly exploding with energy and ambition. This was Australia in the 1850s, as whispers of gold turned into shouts of discovery, sparking one of the most extraordinary transformations in the nation's history. The discovery of gold in Victoria and New South Wales brought more than just wealth. It set off a tidal wave of change. Entire towns sprang up almost overnight. Ballarat, Bendigo, and Kalgoorlie turned into bustling centers of hope and chaos, drawing miners from around the world. Unlike the ghost towns left behind by California's gold rush, these Australian mining hubs thrived, growing into vibrant communities that remain significant today. But the gold rush wasn't only about shiny nuggets or newfound fortunes. It was about the people. Immigrants from England, Ireland, and China flocked to Australia, bringing with them a wealth of cultures, traditions, and determination. It became a cultural melting pot before the phrase even existed, laying the foundation for the rich diversity that defines modern Australia. Here's a little-known fact to blow your mind. Melbourne was once the richest city in the world. That's right. This bustling cosmopolitan hub, now known for its culture and coffee, owes much of its rise to the golden frenzy of the 1850s. When gold fever struck, Melbourne transformed almost overnight. Fortune seekers from across the globe descended on the city, turning it from a modest town into a dazzling metropolis. Streets were paved, grand buildings sprang up, and banks were stacked with unimaginable wealth. Locals proudly nicknamed it Marvelous Melbourne, and it wasn't just hyperbole. At its peak, Melbourne's affluence was unrivaled, making it a beacon of prosperity on the world stage. Picture it: lavish theaters hosting grand performances, opulent mansions lining leafy streets, and a skyline dotted with intricate Victorian architecture. The city thrived on its newfound status as a financial powerhouse, its grandeur earning it comparisons to Paris. To this day, many of Melbourne's most iconic buildings remain as echoes of that gilded age, standing tall as a reminder of when gold was king. Most Melburnians today don't know this chapter of their city's story. They walk the same streets that once symbolized global wealth, unaware that Melbourne was the glittering jewel of the 19th century. It's a fascinating secret woven into the fabric of the city's history, one that adds depth to its already vibrant personality. The Golden Waddle's quiet strength, Melbourne's glittering history, and the peaceful path to independence, these stories show a nation built on resilience, creativity, and bold ideas. Australia isn't just a place, it's an unfolding narrative full of surprises and meaning. Which part of this story spoke to you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. Spread this journey with someone who loves exploring the unexpected, and like if you're ready to dive into more. The story doesn't stop here.